I'd like a big round of applause for Secureworks for showing up. We have a lot of Secureworks representatives here. It's also funny because people are like, well, this is just a big marketing propaganda campaign. Yes, it's literally a marketing propaganda campaign where I bring all of my competitors to one room. Something tells me I'm doing it wrong, but I have actually done work with Secureworks a long time ago. I probably predate almost all of you doing subcontracting work with Secureworks. And they've been a fixture in the security community for a very long time. So I'm going to hand it over to Trenton. And once again, I'm very grateful that once again Secureworks was able to make it. Also, I do want to once again say I've had some people also talk to me and they're like, well, Coalfire's not there. Once again, I think it makes perfect sense that Coalfire is not in the room with us right now. In fact, even if they did call me up and they're like, hey, we want to come on down there, I'd be like, yeah, sure that you want to do that, because that might not be the smartest thing. So once again, Coalfire is here in spirit, we'll kick it on over. So you got it, sir. So take it away. Round of applause once again for it. So thanks.
Thank you. So I'm really excited to be here. Iowa is close to my heart. And I'll mention why in a minute. Today I'd like to talk about what I've dubbed the collaborative adversary. My title at Secureworks is Offensive Research and Development, which means that I have spent the last 9 years of my life being a hacker. And I, as part of my job role, write malware that does terrible things to people's computers. And I believe that that's actually a very good thing that is helping society and helping those around me. And so I would like to explain why that is. So as we mentioned earlier, my name is Trenton Ivey. In the community, you'll often see people use handles to kind of hide the real name. Today, I'm going to do something a little bit different, not something that I'm super comfortable with, but I'm going to go and do it anyway, and share a little bit about me and how I got into this job. We've talked a lot about scope and law and what can go right and what can go wrong. I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about why we pen test and why I think it's a good thing. So I actually didn't get my degree in technology. I started out in biology and chemistry. I went to go do pre-med. My end goal was to work in underprivileged areas to try to help people with medical need. But before going on to med school, I wasn't entirely sure I wanted another 6 years of school and wasn't entirely sure I was sold on medicine. And so I was fortunate enough to go and work at a hospital in a remote part of Zimbabwe. And I got to do all sorts of things that were amazing life experiences. It was a very politically charged environment at the time. So from an adversarial perspective, there were a lot of adversaries. And in the hospital, we'd often have people that would come in from political beatings as one of the common things that we'd see. But while I was there was a virus outbreak of the computer kind. Computers had always been a hobby. It wasn't anything I had thought of making a career out of. But I started working on the computers and trying to fix the computers and really fell in love with the technology side far more than I did the medicine side. So after a 4-year degree, I said, screw it, I'm going to go and do something completely different. I'm going to go into medicine. So I came back to the States. One of the reasons Iowa is so close to me is my first job back in the States was for St. Luke's. At the time, it was Iowa Healthcare. Now it's called Unity Point, and I think we have somebody from the security team representing them today as well. And so I was able to start learning technology and working towards a security career starting here in Iowa. Since then, I have been able to do it was a PCI QSA and PA QSA, which means that every time you swipe your card at a processor, that card goes through several systems, several computers, to get from the point that you swipe it to the bank and back. And I got to audit the companies that helped make sure that that was secure. I also got to break into the computers that were responsible for managing those transactions. From there, I went on to help lead a network team at a Fortune 500 company called FIS, which is also in the financial area. And now I work for Secureworks. I started as on our red team, became the red team technical lead, and now I do more of an R&D role where I actually get to build tools to help our team break stuff. I've been involved in the community since I came back to Iowa. I want to brag on the community just a little bit. So For those of you that aren't familiar with what a CTF is, at these conferences, they set up an environment that looks very much like a small business. There's several different types, but this is one of the common types. You could think of it as almost like esports for hackers. And the goal really is to break into as many systems as you can and find flags that the organizers have hidden on these systems. And people that find the most flags win. And so one year we showed up in force. We brought a whole bunch of people that were professional hackers, did it full time for their job, and we ended up winning the competition. And so we all got together and said, like, hey, what should we do with this? We've got this lifetime badge that will allow us to get into the conference. And we decided that this isn't something we should keep, so we decided to donate it to an organization called HFC. What happened next was what was really amazing, and I think is very representative of the type of people that work in this organization. They outbid each other for quite a while and ended up selling the badge to two different people for $14K. That went on to be, along with several other auctions at the same conference, something to help support Hackers for Charity. It's an organization that is focused on trying to show that hackers can actually do good. The person that founded it actually moved his entire family to Uganda to help children there. Here's a makerspace that was in part funded by the badge and the conference and everybody else that bid on that. So you can see a bunch of kids looking at a 3D printer for the first time. And these are kids that came from a bad environment with lower chances of having a successful life. And now they're being introduced to technology and skills that can help them change the outcome. Also talking about my family. When you get a family and you start having kids, it changes perspective. Short term, you always want to fix the problems now, and when you have kids, you want to think about the problems long term. My wife and I have been involved in foster care. We've had we started with emergency placements and then went into short term, and now we're doing long term. But over the time, we've probably had over 20 kids in our care. And so two of these are biological, two of these are foster. This is their outfits here. They were really jealous that I got to go speak in a library because they love our local library. We always have to tell them to shh. And they were like, I was like, there's going to be a microphone and everything. I get that. So, and of course, my wife was supportive of me getting to come here as well. So I wanted to introduce myself to say, hopefully show two sides, because I think as hackers typically are thought of as the bad guys with the hoodies that are one step away from committing some type of crime and doing some type of evil thing. And I think from my interactions with the ethical hacking community, really everybody has a very similar story. They want to make a difference in the community. They want to bring good change to those that are around them. And they have found that one of the best ways to do that is to act like you are evil, act like you are the bad guy. And so I want to take a look at what it means to be an adversary, different types of adversarial interactions, and how that can be used for good or for bad, depending on perspective. So first premise is that adversaries create power. So I want to look at what adversaries mean, but I think how those adversaries interact and the balance between the power difference really determines the degree of power change. You normally don't think of adversaries and unity in the same sentence, but I think that it's actually far more common than you would imagine. And so I'd like to show some examples of how adversarials can be opposed, but also be unified. And so a couple of points first. Adversaries have opposition. When you think of the word adversary, you usually consider them to be the opposition. You don't think of an adversary as having opposition, but really an adversary requires two parties at minimum for there to be an adversarial interaction. Really, you can flip it, right? From the adversary's perspective, you're the opposition. From the opposition's perspective, you are the adversary. And so it takes two to have an adversary. This is almost circular, but the adversary with the most relative power wins. In physics and in politics, power is defined as the measure of the ability to cause change over time. And so the one with the most power to influence their adversary essentially wins. And adversaries act to acquire and maintain power over their opposition. This is really what makes it an adversarial interaction. If they weren't trying to acquire and maintain power over their opposition, they really wouldn't be an adversary. And so this is the premise of the rest of the talk, that balanced opposition increases power. And so if you look at what that might look like on a graph, you can see that if two parties are competing against each other over time, the power differential that they have actually increases. And so while the competition may be similar over time, the overall power compared to where they begin will actually increase. And I think this is one of the major advantages of pen testing. A political example of this is the increase the nuclear proliferation in the Cold War. So you can see the US in blue and the USSR in red, and the number of total warheads that they have accumulated over time. And you can see that it's not a perfect graph. It doesn't follow the nice, pretty graph that I showed in the prior slide. But this is an example of an arms race in which you have two powers trying to maintain a form of balance. And to do that, they end up increasing power. Now, this is a very complicated topic, and the graph that I had in the prior slide is an oversimplification. There's many different types of power, and the number of warheads is not the only one. And so it's not a perfect graph, but in general, when you have the competition, you see that increase in power. From a technical perspective, I'm sure everybody in this room has been to a website in the last week. When you've done that, you make a request on your computer for it to go and ask for information from another computer. And so one of the common attacks that you'll see in the news and out in the wild, so you call it denial of service. And this is essentially when attackers, whether it be one attacker that is doing it through several compromised systems or many attackers working together, send a whole lot of illegitimate data towards that system. And essentially the idea of the attack is if you can send so much data to the system that you're targeting that it can no longer respond, then the people that actually need to get the data from the site can't. And so they can use this as a negotiating chip, pay us or we'll take your website offline. Many times take your website offline is sending a whole lot of traffic. So you have now an offensive side that is causing harm. So the defensive side can counter that. And so the solution really is to put some type of filter in place that can determine the bad traffic and block it, or can process more traffic more effectively. And so you now have a counter to that, which is an increase in power from the defensive side. And of course, the way that the adversaries come back to counter that is by adding either more traffic or traffic that can get past the filters more effectively. And so if you've watched denial of service attacks over the last 5 to 10 years, you'll see that they used to be, you could take off, like 10 years ago when I started, you could run a network scan from one computer and take off a Fortune 1000 network. Now, one of the most recent attacks is several terabytes a second. Like, it's insane how much these attacks have grown because of that change in power. Another one that you hear often is what you call in-day or O-day, is another term you'll hear thrown around. This basically means that there's an exploit that allows us to break into a computer. And in-day means that it has been patched, but the patch has not been widely applied, right? So you have O-day, nobody knows what the patch is, or the patch hasn't been released. In-day, the patch is available, but it hasn't been applied. And when this happens, there's a power shift. One of the reasons that we say you should hurry and patch if there is an update is because of this power differential. The adversaries have the upper hand before the patch is released or before you apply the patch. But as soon as you apply that, you see that it normalizes. But in this case, even, the adversary now has a new exploit that they can use on unpatched systems. But now there is a patch that helps secure that system and makes it stronger. So again, there's this competitiveness that actually makes both sides better. You have the desire to create new and better exploits every time something gets patched, but you also have the desire to create and patch things to make them more secure over time. This is the Audi S3. It's 2019. Kelly Blue Book said this was the most secure or safest car of 2019. And so the way that this became the most safe car was through things like testing. When they started building cars, and there was an analogy earlier of how unsafe cars used to be, one of the ways that these cars became safe over time is because they realized that testing had to be a part of this process. And as cars get better, they had to find better ways to try to destroy them and cause damage to them. And so you see this back and forth. In this case, unlike the prior examples, which were all negative, denial of service, unauthorized exploitation, or increase of nuclear warheads, this case is something that actually is destruction bringing about good. For those of you that are space nerds like me, you may have seen the Starlink launch. A couple weeks ago, there was 60 satellites that were launched by SpaceX to help with the 5G internet. So like right now, your phone is getting its internet from a cell tower, which you have to kind of like sometimes get just right. Living in Iowa, I know that there are several stretches where it's very hard to get cell reception. Well, SpaceX is trying to solve that by sending a whole bunch of satellites to manage 5G internet down to Earth. And so now you can just, anytime you can see the sky, you're good to go. What's amazing about this launch is not just the satellites. That's pretty technical and awesome, and I love to nerd out hearing about it. But what to me is even more amazing is this. This is the Falcon 9 first stage. They actually used to fall into the ocean, and the salt water would cause them to corrode and basically become useless, costing millions of dollars. Now they're able to launch it and then have it detach and then land autonomously. This is a massive feat of technology and engineering. But they didn't get there by putting all of those satellites on their first attempt. Right? There was a lot of testing and a lot of things that went completely wrong ahead of time. They had engineers that had to decide to run through several different tests, and then once they had several tests of the small components, they put them together and tried to perform additional testing on that as a whole. And as those tests went together, they then were able to ramp up the capability. And you can see that they spent a whole lot of money, a whole lot of time, and caused a whole lot of explosions to get to the point where they are today, where they can actually autonomously land something and reuse it and now save money because of all the investment they put up in securing it up front. Right? So pretty awesome stuff. I kind of want to just leave it here for a minute. But we see the same thing in testing, right? When you invest in security and when you invest in the upfront cost of trying to protect things with an adversary, you try to break it so that you can secure it. I want to tell you a story of 2 of our tests. So we had a client that came to us to ask for a red team. And we did the scope. We figured out what we wanted. There was a physical component. There was a remote component. And we started out with the remote component. And within probably less than it was probably 3 or 4 hours, we had full access to their internal network through a unsecured password that we figured out on the outside, and then Citrix access to the inside the domain. Long story short, a team of hackers were able to completely compromise this organization in less than a day. We had 3 or 4 weeks worth of scope. So the question is now what are we going to do? Some of the fun things from the physical side, the physical security, once you're in a network, you can do all sorts of things. You don't have to break into a building when you have access to the network. We can actually just make our own badges and walk right in. We can turn the cameras off and on whenever we want to. And so it was an incredibly soft target. We were able to break in and do whatever we wanted. We had another client that was much more mature from a security perspective. We came in and we spent several days trying to profile the outside of the network to try to find a soft spot. We finally found something that we were able to leverage for a little bit, but then they caught us and shut us down. They blocked our traffic. We had to escalate and escalate and escalate and escalate our attacks. And in the end, we barely got in. The cool thing about this was that it was the same client 1 year apart. And the way that we were able to do that is using this balance of power. What we did is we set up a situation and we said, things are bad. We really need to improve all over the board. Instead of trying to tell you everything that's wrong with your organization, let's find a way that we can actually try to help balance the power. So we're going to tell you everything that we have done as an organization to break into you, and you can tell us what you're catching and what you're seeing. And what that has enabled us to help them with is increasing that security over time. But there's an unintended consequence as well, is it makes us better. As we figure out how they're catching us, we figure out new ways to evade that. And so we can go back and forth and back and forth. We get better, they get better. And there is this increase in power in both teams. The cool thing is that because we both had the end goal, which was making them the same end goal, which is to make them secure, that power differential increased and it didn't cause them any negative harm, right? They had to go through some testing that maybe was painful and the equivalent of exploding rockets, right? But at the end, it helped them quite a bit. When an adversary comes in that is not part of this collaborative process and that does not have this increase of this power differential, they're no longer able to keep up. So if you look at this, we have start of the year and end of the year, all because of that collaborative cycle. And so there are some things that we have found that work very well when you're trying to balance the power in a way that you can both be opposed but then share the same end goal. And so I've dubbed it the collaborative adversarial cycle. And there are some things that typically get in the way of this. This is Iowa, so this may be a political question, so I apologize. But how many people here feel that they are less influenced by all the political campaigns than those around them right now? Everybody feel like they're probably less influenced? Okay. Couple hands, yeah. If you ask a large group of people that, generally the answer is everybody says yes. Those around me are far less influenced by the campaigns that are going on right now. But if you do the math, that can't be right because at least half the people are wrong. And so there are these things called cognitive biases that affect us all. Just part of being human. They happen. And I think trying to identify them and build a process around avoiding them is really important to making things like this work. When you have two teams that are opposed, one wants to break in, one wants to defend, you have to find a way to identify these biases and minimize them as quickly as possible. So the way that we do it is first identify assertions. It helps to document what your assertions are. So when you go into an environment, you can say, this is what we believe to be true, or this is what we at least assume to be true. From the defensive side, some of these that we'll get is, we don't think you can breach our perimeter. There's no way you're getting in. Other ones is, we think our encryption adequately protects this environment or this data. Or maybe we put this fix in and we think it takes care of the vulnerability. Or we just took an action that will get rid of this threat actor we know is in our environment. On the offensive side, we can say, we think we can breach the perimeter and we can steal all the data before you stop us. And we think that we can bypass the control without you catching us. These are very different assertions on both sides of the fence. Each opponent comes into it with a different idea of what reality is. And it's important to document that up front so that both parties are aware of what the other party's assertions are. Once you've defined those, then you can establish an experiment. So this is really just a refactoring of the scientific method, which has a pretty decent track record, I think. Once you've defined what your assertions are, you can run an experiment to try to support and contradict the assertion. Now, there's this thing called the congruence bias, which is the tendency to test hypotheses that are exclusively through direct testing instead of the possible alternative hypotheses. We see this all the time. People get some new fancy security solution and they say, I tested my security solution and it worked exactly as we expected it to. And then a red teamer comes in and says, but you didn't change the default password. And so there are these sets of assumptions, and it's really easy to test something that you think will work, and it works, but you forget about all the other things around it. So come up with a good experiment, and then once you've performed that experiment collaboratively, both sides of the party need to come together and then evaluate that reality. Determine what the reality is based off of the results. It's very tempting to try to define reality based off of what your assumptions were, but really the data and the experiment need to support what reality actually is. And so it's important to focus on the validity or the lack of it for prior assertions. This is important. Don't try to determine lessons learned until everybody agrees on reality. I see all the time that people start to try to put fingers at others or try to start trying to apply things before there's actually consensus on what happened and what reality is. And so start with evaluating reality. If there's a disagreement on reality, really try to go back and identify other ways you can perform an experiment to really get a grasp of what is real in the environment. And then next, evaluate reality. A couple of the biases that can get in the way of evaluating reality is belief bias. So I see a lot of arguments where there is something that seems like it must absolutely be true, and therefore they think reality is based off of that assumption, even after the experiment has been presented. I've spent so many times with the board after we completely owned everything in their environment where they said, well, we just spent $5 million on this new system. We just added, X provider or whatever that assumption may be. And they just can't believe the results that we were presenting them, that no, here's a hard drive with 2 terabytes worth of your most sensitive data. And so really, when you evaluate reality, it's part of the value of this collaborative cycle is having that data to go back and challenge belief bias. Another one is confirmation bias. When you have 2 teams with opposing viewpoints, it's very tempting to want to focus on the things that you believe to be true and continue to confirm what your assertions were. This is, again, why it's important to document things and important to collect that data over time. And then after you've done that, then come lessons learned. I think both sides should take something away and learn from each other. I think the coal fire incident lately is a perfect example of both sides having the ability to learn from each other. I have been doing this for probably 9 years, and I've been very fortunate to not have a lot of times where our team has gone out of scope, but it's happened a couple of times. I think the reason that I haven't ever had it bite me is because of communication. Not that I'm perfect at it, but the testers that I see put the most emphasis on communication and learning from their clients as much as their clients can learn from them are the ones that stay out of trouble the most. Not that it always works, but it's a good place to start. If you're not learning, you're doing something wrong. like I said, I've been doing this for almost 10 years. We have interns that will come in and teach me a new way to hack or some new way to think about something. As soon as you stop learning, you are probably more of a detriment to the industry than a help. Now, once that whole process has happened collaboratively, this is where the teams really need to split up. So in the case of pen testing, you have the offensive team and the defensive team. Those that are trying to break in and those that are trying to defend. And the adversaries in this case being opposing parties, not pen testers, should independently create their own goals. One of the biggest confrontations that I see after an engagement is that the offensive side says, you must go do this, defenders, or the defensive team says, like, this isn't fair, like, we need to redo. And so I think splitting up the way that you create goals and making that responsible for each of the adversarial parties independently is important. Now, one of the things that if you are working with a pen tester, we fall prey to this quite often. It's called the availability heuristic, which is the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of events with a greater availability. We get paid to break into some of the world's most secure companies every single week. And we are unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on the perspective, almost always successful. I'd say we probably have an 80 to 90% track rate on appropriately scoped engagements. That's sort of terrifying when you think about it. Give a team of skilled hackers a week to target somebody and they can get in. And we see this over and over and over and over. And so it's very easy for us to overestimate the risks of these attacks actually happening. Could they happen? Absolutely. Are they likely to happen? There's a tendency for us to overestimate it. And so when you're creating goals, this is another reason for it to be split out. The adversary can make a goal based off of how likely they think a certain attack will work or won't work. But the defensive team also needs to be able to make decisions and base priorities off of how often they think that is. And if you run through the cycle once, it's not very helpful. But what you see is when each team makes independent goals over time and you run through the cycle several different times, those goals tend to fall into alignment and the availability heuristic tends to become less of a sticking point. And then finally, complete goals. So each side should really independently complete goals. The offensive side shouldn't be responsible for creating defensive countermeasures, and the defensive side shouldn't be coming up with exploits for the offensive team to use. Not to say that both teams shouldn't learn what each other do or work on both sides, but from the perspective of this collaborative cycle, really, if you're responsible for defense, do defense. If you're responsible for offense, do offense. And then out of that, you can make new assertions based off of the change. So we made this new patch. We think that you can no longer get into the system. Or we came up with a new piece of malware. We think it will go by undetected. And then from there, you can repeat the cycle again. One thing to watch out for is the Peltzman effect. So as you run through this cycle, you begin to feel like you're more and more secure. And one of the side effects of that is that people will often take more and more risks associated with that. And so you have to be very careful that because the cycle will make you feel more secure, you see the value coming from the test over and over and over. Don't become too secure or too overconfident in taking risks. So we've talked about adversaries. I started with hopefully laying out what an adversary is and how we generally perceive them as a bad thing. But in reality, they actually drive change and create power. And if leveraged appropriately, that can be a very good thing that can help you and your organization and can bring about positive change in the society. I think really the balance between the adversaries is what makes that change impactful. And so find an adversary that will work with you. Give them the information about your environment and let them give you the information back and make that as collaborative as possible, because that will bring about the most amount of positive change in your environment. With that, I think, I'm not sure how we're doing on time, but if we have any time, I'd love to, might be finishing up here a little bit early. Do we have any questions from anybody? It can be about this talk or pen testing in general. All right, I don't know if we have any questions online. If not, I'll hand it back to you.
I'll hand it over to Jason. He's probably reading questions right now.
Gotcha.
So Jason, do we have any questions online?
We currently don't have any, but I can ask everyone. If you do have questions at this time, feel free to ask. If not, you did cover everything really, really well.
So. All right, fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much. Round of applause.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I've lost my agenda, but yeah, I really want to kind of re-echo some of those sentiments as it relates to architecture, right? the idea of SpaceX and the rocket failing again and again and again, I think is a great example. But another example and a way to describe it to people is how long this takes. So even if you're looking at rocket technology, that rocket technology goes back to pre-World War II, right? That's a long time. And when you're looking at architecture as it relates to even buildings, I think it gives you a better idea as far as the time frames and the scales of what we're dealing with. I always tell this story in a lot of my classes. I want you to think back, thousands of years ago, there's two guys and they're building mud huts, and then some jackass UGG shows up and like knocks over the mud hut and says, "You guys suck, I knocked over your mud hut." And like, okay, he's coming back. We're gonna put some stone in our mud and see if that works. He still comes and it's a little bit harder and he shoves it over and they're like, "Dang it. Well, maybe we can use some wood and we can thatch it together." And then hurricanes come and knock things down. And over years, hundreds, thousands of years, architectures slowly got better. They got stronger. They got more resilient. And if you're looking at it, and I say this all the time, even if you look at a room like this, if you go back like even a couple thousand years, a room like this would have been near impossible with the engineering standards that people had back then. And if you're looking at engineering and you're looking at architecture, one of the things that's ever so important for architectural and structural engineering, and I know this because my wife is a structural engineer, is that it's based completely on the understanding of failures. Every single component in this entire library has a failure point. You can look it up. You can go and you can look at AASHTO standards. You can look at load factor resistance design standards for doors. When you buy that door has gone through testing, and they will tell you exactly how much weight that door can take before it collapses. And that beam, you're standing right in front of a beam and that column going in, they know exactly how much weight that column can take before it fails. But here's where it gets interesting. They also design buildings in such a way that any one component within a building can fail and the entire building doesn't catastrophically collapse. That column can fail, the column in the back can fail. You've seen pictures of houses where cars have literally gone off the road, hit the house, and the house is still standing. It has a car in the attic for some reason. You don't know exactly how that happened, but the house itself is still standing. So whenever you're looking at architecture, you're looking at design, it's an understanding of components, it's an understanding of the materials, and it's an understanding that any given component can and will fail at any given time. And the rest of the architecture has to support that. And really, penetration testers are the structural engineers of IT security. We are the people that are finding flaws in architectures. We are the people that are finding flaws in the various components. We are testing, designing, breaking, and then making things better. So I absolutely love that analogy, and it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. So that was just absolutely fantastic.